Hey everyone, welcome back to Darkverse. I'm Isaac Nightshade, and tonight I have a story that'll send chills down your spine. It's about a friend who thought he was escaping a nightmare, only to realize it was just beginning. So, sit back, turn off the lights, and prepare yourself for a terrifying journey into the unknown. I had always been a night owl, staying up late to watch TV or read. My house was quiet, almost too quiet, but it was the kind of silence I had gotten used to over the years. Nothing unusual ever really happened here, just the mundane hum of life. But that night something felt off. It was just past midnight when I settled into the living room, wrapped in a blanket, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the only sound to break the silence. The house, an old two-story place I inherited from my aunt, always had this feeling of being empty, even when I was the only one inside. The walls creaked, the floors groaned, sounds you'd expect from a house that had stood for over a century. But there was a certain comfort in that, in the familiarity of the creaks and groans, as if the house and I had come to understand each other over the years. I flicked on the TV, my fingers automatically searching for the remote on the couch's armrest. I didn't even bother to choose a show. I just needed the background noise to fill the void. The static buzz of the television was oddly soothing. It felt like the perfect escape after a long, exhausting day. I sank deeper into the couch, the fabric cold against my skin. My eyes began to grow heavy, but I wasn't tired, just in that sleepy haze when your mind starts to drift. The house around me seemed to settle, the sounds of the night becoming almost lullaby-like. The wind picked up outside, gently tapping against the windows like a soft knot. I imagined the branches of the old oak tree in the yard brushing against the glass. A storm was coming. I could feel it in my bones. I had lived in the house for 3 years now, and there had always been something about the way the wind howled that made me uneasy. It wasn't the wind itself, but the way it seemed to scrape the walls in certain places, like it was trying to get in. I've never been superstitious, but something about the way the house whispered to me made me want to ignore it. I wasn't going to let my imagination take over, not to. Just as my eyelids began to flutter shut, I heard it. A soft, breathy whisper. It was so faint at first that I wasn't sure I heard it at all. But then it came again. My name, clear, sharp. Sarah. I froze. My heart skipped in my chest, the blood in my veins turning cold. I wasn't alone. I was sure of it. The voice had come from deep inside the house, not from the TV or the wind or anything I could rationalize away. I sat up quickly, my blanket falling to the floor with a soft rust. The house was silent again, save for the hum of the fridge and the faint tapping of the tree against the window. I looked toward the hallway, the darkness stretching out from the end like some inescapable void. The house was old. Every room had its corners, its hidden spaces where shadows played tricks on your eyes. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just out of sight, waiting for me to notice. My pulse quickened, my breathing shallow. Did I imagine? I whispered to myself, but I already knew the answer. No, I hadn't imagined it. The whisper came again, this time louder, closer. Sarah, my name, repeated like a command, chilled me to my core. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it was so distinct, so familiar that I felt my stomach twist in knots. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. Slowly, I moved toward the hallway. The house seemed to grow quieter the closer I got, the air thick and heavy, like I was walking through a dream. I knew the house well. I knew every creak in the floorboards, every squeak of the doors. But tonight the house felt different. It felt wrong. The silence was too deep, too oppressive. I reached the foot of the stairs, the darkness above swallowing any light that tried to fight its way through. I called out, my voice wavering. Hello? Is someone there? No answer. I swallowed hard and stepped forward, my feet dragging across the old wooden floors. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step a painful reminder of just how empty the house was. Every room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. The whisper, my name, came again, louder this time, as though it was following me. My mind raced, each thought more frantic than the last. I reached the top of the stairs, the hallway stretching out in front of me like an endless tunnel. At the far end was the guest room, where I'd stored all the things I never used, the forgotten relics of my aunt's life. It was an odd room, filled with old furniture, antique trinkets, and dusty bookshelves. I avoided it most of the time. It felt like a place that hadn't been touched in decades, and every time I stepped inside I felt like an intruder. But the door was slightly ajar now, just a crack. It hadn't been like that before, I was sure of it. The voice came again, this time a rasping hiss in my ear. Sarah. My heart raced. I moved toward the guest room, every step feeling heavier than the last. The door groaned as I pushed it open, the sound sharp and unnatural. The room was still, almost eerily. Dust hung in the air like a fog, settling on the furniture, the bookshelves, the old armchair by the window. There was nothing there, no person, no intruder, just the silence. The heavy, suffocating silence. I turned around, my mind racing to make sense of everything. But then out of the corner of my eye, I saw something in the mirror. The reflection didn't match reality. It wasn't just the room, it was the shape standing behind me. A shadow, tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the dim light. But it was there, in the reflection, watching me. I whipped around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing behind me, just the empty room. I took a shaky breath, my hand gripping the doorframe for support. This was insane. I had to be imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something was standing just out of sight, watching me, waiting for me to turn around. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in quick panicked bursts. I didn't know what was going on, but I couldn't stay in this house anymore. Not like this. I turned to leave, but as I did I heard it again, the whisper. Now sharp and urgent. Sarah, you shouldn't have left. I froze, the blood draining from my face. That voice, it wasn't coming from anywhere in the room, it was inside my head, like a thought I hadn't invited. A sound I couldn't escape. I looked back at the door. The silence seemed to press in around me, too thick to breathe through. I couldn't leave, not yet, not until I understood what was happening. But what if I didn't want to understand? What if I was better off running? I turned back to the mirror, and this time the reflection wasn't mine. The shadow was clearer now, its face distorted, like it was trying to take form but couldn't. The more I stared, the more it twisted, the more it knew me. Sarah, it whispered again, but this time it wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea, it was a promise. You'll never be alone again. I stumbled back, my breath hitching in my chest. I didn't know what that meant, but deep down, I knew I couldn't escape. It wasn't the house that was haunted, it was me. For days after that first whisper, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. A trick of the wind maybe, or my mind playing games with me in the quiet empty house. I had always been a bit of a night owl, and with the house so still, the silence seemed to amplify everything. The slightest sound, the smallest shift in the air. I'd been through this before, the odd creaks of an old house at night, the moans of the floorboards settle. I was used to it, or at least I wanted to be. But this was different. The first night, the whisper was so faint I could have dismissed it. A whispering. Sarah, barely audible, as if carried by the wind through a cracked window. But the sound lingered long after the wind died down. For the next few days, it came and went, soft and distant. Like a voice just out of reach, lingering in the edges of my consciousness. It was as if the world itself was trying to speak to me, through the shadows of the house. At first I thought I was just being paranoid. I didn't want to admit it, but the idea that something might be wrong, something I couldn't see or understand, gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. It was subtle, too subtle to be sure of, but it was there, pulling at my attention. A whisper, a name, my name, Sarah. I found myself checking corners of rooms, peering under furniture, opening closets and drawers, half expecting to find someone, or something hiding in the dark spaces. I even pulled the curtains open a few times, expecting to see someone standing in the yard. There was nothing there, no one. The house was as empty as it always had been, yet the whisper persisted, relentless, like a secret I wasn't supposed to hear. I tried to dismiss it. I told myself it was just my mind, a figment of my overactive imagination. But each time I ignored it, the voice came back, louder, closer, more insistent. There were nights when it felt like the sound was right behind me, breathing my name in my ear, just before I fell asleep. It wasn't like the sound of someone calling from another room, or the wind picking up. It was intimate, as though the whisperer knew me, knew my thoughts, knew my fears. One evening, as I sat on the couch, reading a book by the dim light of a lamp, the whisper broke through again. This time it was louder than ever, clear and sharp. Sarah, but it wasn't just in my head. No, this time it was real, physical. A voice right there in the room with me. I froze, the book slipping from my hands and hitting the floor with a soft thud. My heart skipped a beat as I turned my head slowly, scanning the shadow. The house was quiet as usual, the faint hum of the fridge the only noise breaking the silence. I waited for the voice to come again, to give me a reason to believe it was real, to make sense of it, but there was nothing, just the stillness of the room, the air thick with the weight of an invisible presence. I shook my head, exhaling slowly, as I stood up. This was ridiculous. I was hearing things. I was tired, overstressed, maybe even a little bit paranoid after spending too many late nights alone in the house. I made myself move, crossing the room to turn off the lamp, the shadows growing deeper around me as the light flickered out. I'd barely reached the hallway when I heard it again, this time unmistakable. Sarah. It wasn't just the whisper this time, it was right next to me, the voice in my ear, as though someone was standing just behind me, breathing down my neck. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My pulse quickened, blood rushing in my ears. I didn't want to turn around, I didn't want to look, didn't want to confirm the feeling that had crawled up my spine, but I had to. I had to see. I turned slowly, my feet cold against the floor, my body tense with dread. I expected to see someone standing there. Someone, anyone, a person, but there was no one. Just the empty hallway stretching into darkness. The sound of my name was gone, and yet I felt it lingering in the air, thick and heavy, like a presence that refused to leave. I swallowed hard, feeling the bitter taste of fear in my throat. I couldn't explain it, I didn't want to. The thought that something or someone was watching me, waiting for me to acknowledge it, made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I didn't sleep that night. The whispering had only grown worse, relentless in its intrusion. Every time I closed my eyes I could hear it, soft, insistent, my name as though it was being breathed into my very soul. It was like it was coming from within me, or from somewhere so deep inside the house, that I couldn't pinpoint it. The house itself had taken on a sinister air, the silence no longer comforting, but stifling. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows feeling like they were stretching, reaching for me. The next day, I told myself it was just a phase. I was imagining things, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more persistent the voice became. By the time night fell again, I could already feel the creeping dread settling in my bones. I tried to distract myself, keeping the lights on, keeping the TV running, but no matter what I did, the whispering never stopped. I had to know. I had to find out what was happening, what this voice was, and where it was coming from. It was driving me insane. The constant tugging at the edges of my mind. I couldn't live like this anymore. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I waited. I waited in the dark. The house was eerily still, the kind of stillness that feels unnatural, like the air itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I sat in the living room, the light from the TV casting flickering shadows across the wall. My heart was pounding in my chest, my thoughts racing with dread. Every creak, every gust of wind outside made me jump, my body tensing with the anticipation of the next whisper. It came. This time it wasn't just a whisper. It wasn't soft or distant. It was clear. It was right next to me. I felt the breath on the side of my face, a chill against my skin, and the voice was unmistakable. Sarah. It was too close, too real. I jumped up, the sound of my own heart hammering in my ears. My breath was shallow, my hands trembling as I spun around, looking for the source of the voice. But as before, there was no one, nothing. The room was empty, the darkness pressing in from every angle. I felt a coldness, deep and suffocating, filling the space around me. Then something shifted. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, more solid, as if they were drawing together, congealing into something. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was forming, what was taking shape out of the darkness. But I couldn't stop myself. And then I heard it again. Sarah. It wasn't a voice anymore. It was a growl, low and guttural, like something ancient and angry. And this time, I didn't need to turn around to know that whatever was behind me, whatever had been calling my name, was real, and it was coming for me.
It was a cold evening when I first noticed the sudden drop in temperature. The kind of night where the air feels heavy, thick with the promise of rain. I had just returned home from work, feeling the familiar exhaustion creeping into my bones. The house was silent as usual, its stillness almost suffocating. I didn't think much of the chill at first, chalking it up to the cooling night air, or maybe the draft sneaking in through a crack in the window. But as I walked past the living room on my way to the kitchen, something stopped me. The temperature, no, the air felt different. It wasn't just the typical drop of evening. It was a sudden sharp cold that hit me like a slap in the face. My breath caught in my throat, a white puff of air escaping my lips as if I were standing outside on a winter day, not inside my house, which was normally warm and cozy. I stood there for a moment, frozen, unsure if I was imagining it. I could feel the warmth of the kitchen behind me, the oven still giving off a faint heat from dinner. But here, in the living room, the air felt thick and frigid, like the temperature had dropped below freezing in the span of a heart. My skin prickled, the hairs on my arms rising as I turned slowly, looking for the source. There was nothing obvious, nothing that could explain it. No open windows, no broken seals in the door. Nothing that would cause such an abrupt temperature change. I walked into the room, the coldness intensifying with every step, until it was like walking through a fog of ice. I paused in the middle of the room, staring at the space around me. The shadows of the furniture seemed darker here. Somehow, and the once familiar objects, a couch, a lamp, the TV now seemed like strange shapes, looming in the darkness. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me, and I suddenly became very aware of how utterly alone I was. The cold was almost oppressive, suffocating in its silence. I shook my head, trying to push the feeling away. It's just a draft, I told myself, repeating the words like a mantra. Old houses have drafts, nothing to worry about. But then the cold grew worse. It wasn't just a draft anymore. It was like the room had become a void, a place where warmth could no longer exist. The kind of cold you feel deep in your bones. The kind of cold that makes your teeth ache and your joints stiff. The air itself seemed to pulse, like it was alive, moving around me, surrounding me with something unnatural. I took a step forward, half expecting the chill to recede, but it didn't. It pressed in on me, growing more intense. My breath came out in sharp bursts, visible in the air in front of me, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. There was no breeze, no fan, no logical explanation for this sudden suffocating cold. I turned, walking around the living room, trying to find the source, but the cold followed me, like an invisible hand trailing behind. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud against the floorboards, each one echoing through the room. I felt a sense of unease creeping in, the kind of feeling you get when you know something's wrong but can't quite put your finger on it. I felt watched. The air seemed to thicken with each passing second, as if the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stepped back toward the far corner of the room, where the cold was most intense, and instinctively, my hand reached out to the air. My fingers brushed against the invisible wall of freezing air that hung there, suspended in the darkness. The moment my skin touched it, the temperature shot up, unnaturally fast, almost violently. The cold snapped away in an instant, replaced by a heat that felt like it came from nowhere. My fingers recoiled from the air, the sudden shift in temperature making my body tremble. I stood there wide-eyed, heart pounding in my chest, staring at the spot where the cold had been only moments before. I wanted to dismiss it. I had to dismiss it, but the rush of heat, followed by that chilling cold, left me with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. My mind raced for a logical explanation. Maybe it was the old heater in the room malfunctioning, or perhaps the furnace was on the fritz. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. This wasn't something as simple as a malfunction. No, this was something else. Something unnatural. I stepped back, trying to distance myself from the spot where the cold had been. My breath still came out in shallow gasps, my heart racing. The room felt wrong now, heavy with the lingering presence of something I couldn't see, something I couldn't explain. I turned, my eyes scanning the room for anything that could make sense of this. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper now, darker than before. The light from the lamp flickered, casting strange, jittery shadows on the walls, and I felt my anxiety rising, my skin crawling. Something wasn't right. I knew that much, at least. I moved toward the kitchen, desperate to leave the living room, but as I walked away, I could still feel the weight of that cold lingering in the air, following me like a shadow. I grabbed the edge of the doorway, trying to steady myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had changed, that someone was watching me. I tried to tell myself I was being irrational, that I was just tired, that the house was old, and it creaked, and it groaned, and of course it was cold in some places. But as I stood in the kitchen, with the warmth of the oven still lingering, I couldn't help but feel like the cold wasn't just a physical sensation. It felt intentional. I couldn't help but go back to the living room. I don't know what I was hoping to find. Maybe I thought the cold would be gone, that the room would return to normal if I just ignored it long enough. But as I stepped back into the living room, the air was heavy again, suffocating. The cold had returned, just as it had been before, but this time it felt different, like it had settled in, like it wasn't planning to leave anytime soon. I stepped back into the spot where the cold had first been. I didn't know why I did. I didn't know why I felt compelled to return to that spot. But the moment I did, the temperature dropped again, this time slower, more deliberate. My skin prickled, my teeth clenched against the chill. It wasn't just the cold anymore. It was the way the air felt still, like it was holding something back. The shadows in the corners seemed to pulse, shifting as if alive. I thought I saw something in the corner of my eye, a figure moving in the darkness, but when I turned, there was nothing. I breathed out slowly, trying to steady myself, but then came a sound, a faint, almost inaudible whisper. My name, Sarah. It was soft but unmistakable, like it was being spoken into the very air around me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The cold deepened, wrapping around me like a vice. And the whisper came again, clearer this time, almost like a warning. Sarah. I wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. My breath was shallow, my pulse raced. I tried to call out to say something, but the words got stuck in my throat. I felt a presence then, just behind me, an undeniable sensation that someone or something was standing in the room with me, watching me. I slowly turned my head, my eyes scanning the shadows, but there was nothing there, just the dark corners of the room, stretching deeper than they should. I blinked, and then in the reflection of the window I saw the faintest outline of a figure, standing just behind me, obscured by the shadows. But it wasn't just the outline of a person, it was wrong. The shape was twisted, blurry, as though the figure was part of the darkness itself, moving in ways that didn't make sense. My blood ran cold as I realized that whatever was standing there, whatever was watching me, wasn't human. The cold surged again, overwhelming me, and in that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. Not in this house, not anymore. The house was eerily quiet that evening, the kind of silence that makes the smallest sounds seem unnervingly loud. I had been sitting at my desk for hours, my eyes glued to the screen, trying to focus on a project that never seemed to get fit. The lamp beside me flickered occasionally, casting long distorted shadows across the room. It wasn't exactly a comfortable atmosphere, but it was home, or at least, it had been. I had been feeling the weight of the house more and more lately, like it was settling into itself, growing heavier with each passing day. The creaks in the floorboards, the occasional gust of wind that rattled the windows, these had once been familiar sounds, but lately they had taken on a sinister edge. The house seemed more aware of me, or maybe I had just become hyper-aware of it. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but my mind kept drifting back to the strange feeling that had been building up inside me. It was the same dread I couldn't quite shake, the feeling of being watched even when I knew I was alone. But I dismissed it, as I always did, pushing the thoughts back into the dark recesses of my mind. Then it happened. I was sitting there lost in thought, when I heard it. A voice, soft and familiar, floating down the hallway. It was my mother's voice, that soft, comforting tone I had known my entire life. Sarah. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, crystal clear, like she was standing just on the other side of the door, calling me softly, as she had so many times before when I was younger. A gentle tone that always made me feel safe, like everything was right in the world. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I hadn't heard from her in weeks. She had been away visiting my aunt, but surely she had returned. I stood up almost instinctively, my chair scraping the floor as I pushed it back. A small wave of warmth and relief washed over me. I hadn't realized how much I had missed her voice until now. "Mom?" I called softly, the word escaping my lips before I had time to process why I was even asking. I stepped into the hallway, expecting to see her standing there smiling, ready to tell me she was home. But there was no one in the hallway, no one anywhere. I stood there for a moment, my mind trying to make sense of what had just happened. My pulse quickened, and the air seemed to grow thicker around me, the house pressing in closer. I swallowed hard, a strange feeling creeping up my spine. It wasn't like I hadn't heard things before. Old houses settle, and the pipes make noises, and sometimes the wind creates strange sounds. But this felt different. I turned slowly, glancing back toward the desk, the room behind me now seeming far emptier, far cold. I knew I was just being irrational. It was late. I was tired. I'd probably imagined it. There was no reason to worry. But as I reached to grab the doorframe to head back into my room, it came again. "Sarah." This time the voice was louder, closer, more insistent. I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was unmistakable, but something was wrong. I didn't know why at first, but my stomach twisted. The tone had shifted, something darker in it now, something more perfect. There was no hesitation, no faltering. It was too smooth, too calculated, like it had been rehearsed, or worse, like it wasn't a voice at all but a mimicry. "Mom?" I asked again, but the question felt hollow, like I was asking a question that had already been answered. I stepped cautiously back toward the hallway, my shoes clicking quietly against the hardwood floor. My pulse thudded loudly in my ears, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on edge. I didn't know why I felt this strange dread crawling up my spine, but it was growing, pulsing, wrapping itself around my chest. I stepped closer to the stairs, my hand trembling slightly as I placed it against the railing. "Sarah," the voice came again, louder and close. This time it didn't just echo down the hall, it seemed to fill the air around me, circling, surrounding me. It wasn't just my mother's voice, it was too perfect, too controlled, too wrong. I backed up slowly, feeling like the walls were closing in around me. The living room was bathed in an unsettling half-light, the shadows deepening, moving as if they had a life of their own. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the space just ahead of me, the place where the hallway turned into darkness, where the voice seemed to be coming from. I wanted to scream, to shout for someone, anyone, but I couldn't. My body felt heavy, my thoughts scrambled. Something about that voice, the way it echoed through the house, kept me rooted in place. My feet felt as though they were glued to the floor, a terrible weight pressing down on me. "Sarah." The whisper wasn't soft anymore. It was insistent, hungry. It seemed to drip into my skin, curling around my mind, pulling at me, testing me. I blinked, trying to clear the haze in my thoughts, and when I opened my eyes again, the hallway was no longer just a hallway. It was wrong. The shadows there stretched longer, darker, like they were reaching out toward me. The voice came again, louder this time, piercing, and then without warning, it shifted, dropping the softness, and taking on a harsh, guttural edge that made my blood run cold. "Sarah." My name spoken, with such precision, such clarity, but with a tone that was no longer even familiar. It was cold, it was mocking, it was not my mother's voice. I felt my breath catch in my throat, the air in the room feeling suddenly thick, as if it were choking. I turned quickly, my heart slamming against my ribs, and the hallway behind me felt like it was stretching infinitely into the dark. I could feel something, or someone moving in that space, just beyond my reach, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I wanted to call out again. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. My voice felt like it was trapped inside my body, my throat closing up as the weight of the darkness pressed in tighter. I had to get out of here. I had to leave this place. I stumbled backward, bumping into the wall, feeling the cold wood against my palm as I reached blindly for the light switch. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was more than that, too much more. It was an avalanche,
crashing down over me. A wave of sound that filled my skull, reverberating in every inch of my body. "Sarah," it repeated, over and over, each repetition growing louder, more distorted. It was tearing at me, scraping at the edges of my mind, like it wanted to get inside, to consume me. I turned and fled into the living room, my feet stumbling over the carpet, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift with me, keeping pace, moving closer, following me. It felt like I was losing myself, like the very walls of the house were pressing in around me, suffocating me, in a nightmare I couldn't escape. I didn't know what was happening, but one thing was painfully clear: whatever was in the house with me, whatever was calling my name, was not my mother, and it was not finished with me yet. It was a few days after the incident with the voice, the strange, impossible voice that had called my name when I knew no one was there, that I found the mirror. It wasn't something I had been looking for, nor something I had even thought to explore. But that day, the house felt different, as though something was beckoning me toward it. The attic, to be specific. I had never been particularly drawn to the attic. It was a place I only visited when I had to, a storage space for old boxes of things I never used. Dust and webs hung thick in the air, and the dim light from the single bulb did little to push back the shadows. But that morning, something was different. I didn't know what it was. Perhaps it was the constant unease creeping up inside me, or maybe it was just the way the air felt heavier than usual, but I couldn't ignore the pull. Something had to be up there, and for reasons I still don't understand, I had to find. I climbed the narrow stairs slowly, each step creaking underfoot, as though the house itself was whispering in warning. The door to the attic was always a bit difficult to open, its old hinges groaning in protest as I pushed it open. A musty, stale smell greeted me, the air thick with dust and age. I squinted into the gloom, my breath fogging up in front of me. It was then that I saw it, the mirror. It was leaning against the far wall, partially hidden behind a pile of old furniture. The frame was gold, though it had faded over the years, the paint chipped and cracked in place. The glass was speckled with dust, tarnished, but still oddly reflective. Something about it drew me in, a feeling I couldn't explain. It wasn't the mirror itself, mirrors were commonplace, but rather the sense that it had been waiting for me like it knew I was coming. Curiosity gnawed at me as I stepped closer. My fingers brushed against the edge of the frame, and a strange chill ran up my spine. The wood felt cold under my touch, like it had been abandoned for far longer than I had expected. I ran my hand over the glass, clearing off a patch of dust, and for a moment I thought I saw something. A flicker, something moving just below the surface. I paused, staring at the spot. It was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But the moment I wiped away the dust, I was hit with an overwhelming sense of recognition. It was like I had seen this mirror before, or perhaps something about it had seen me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I shook my head, forcing the thought aside. I didn't know what I was thinking when I decided to take it downstairs. I didn't know why I thought hanging it across from my bed would be a good idea. I just did. It felt like the right thing to do in the moment, as though the mirror was calling out to me, asking to be placed where I could see it most. So I did. The moment I hung it, I felt a shift in the air, like the room had become slightly colder. A subtle shift, but enough for me to note it. The whispering started soon after. At first it was faint, just like before, like a distant murmur from the far end of the house. I thought I was imagining it, the sound slipping into my thoughts as I drifted off to sleep. But the next night, the whispering came again, and then again, loud, clearer. It was coming from the mirror. I woke up to the sound of my name, faint, like a breeze across the back of my neck. Sarah. My eyes snapped open, my body tense, as if the very air around me had been laced with dread. I lay there in the dark, staring at the mirror across from my bed, feeling the hairs on my arms rise. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs. Sarah, the whisper came again. It was softer now, but unmistakable, echoing from the mirror as though it were alive. I turned my head slowly, my eyes fixed on the reflective surface. Nothing. The mirror only reflected the dim light of the room, the shadows of the furniture, and my own wide-eyed face staring back at me. But the air had shifted, like something was waiting. Something was hidden within the glass. It wasn't just the reflection of my room, there was something more. I wanted to look away, to turn my back on it, but my body refused to obey. The whispering wasn't just in my ears, it was in my mind now, crawling under my skin, a chill that gripped my heart. I blinked, And then I saw it. A shape. At first it was nothing more than a fleeting movement. Something shifting in the periphery of my vision, just out of the corner of my eye. My stomach lurched, my pulse quickening as I turned my head sharply. But when I looked directly into the mirror, I saw it. A shadow. It was standing just behind me. My breath caught in my throat. I felt it before I saw it. A presence lurking there. Something dark and ominous, hanging just out of the light. I couldn't see its features, but I could feel it. Something tall looming over me. A shape. A silhouette. Like a shadow cast from the depths of the mirror itself. I turned. Nothing. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing in my chest. My feet were cold against the floor as I walked slowly toward the mirror, my hands trembling. The reflection was unchanged. The room was the same. The shadows stretched across the walls, but there was no figure standing behind me. I reached out and touched the glass, my fingers brushing over the cool surface. Nothing, just the faint fog of my breath against the mirror. I pulled my hand back, my mind whirling with confusion and fear. Had I imagined it? No, it was real. It had to be real. But as I stepped back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something I couldn't understand. The whispering grew louder, louder, swirling around me like the very air was thick with the sound of my name. Sarah. It was like the room was closing in around me, the mirror pulling at my very soul. I stepped back from the mirror, my pulse thundering. The voice in my head was no longer just a whisper. It was an insistent call demanding my attention. But still I couldn't bring myself to look away. The mirror had me. It knew me, knew everything about me. The longer I stared, the more it felt like the reflection wasn't my own. The shadows, the darkness behind me, everything felt off. The edges of the mirror warped slightly, like the surface was breathing, undulating in and out, as if alive. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run far away from this house, from the mirror, from whatever it was that was calling to me, that thing that seemed to have stepped out of the dark, waiting for the moment when I was weak enough to notice it. But I couldn't move. I couldn't stop staring. Then a movement in the reflection. This time it wasn't just the shadow. It was a figure, a woman tall and thin, with her back to me. Her outline was dark, her features hidden in the swirling darkness of the mirror. She was wearing something old, like a dress, flowing and frayed, like something forgotten. She was standing directly behind me now, and I could see her in the reflection of the glass, but not in the room. I turned sharply, my heart in my throat. There was nothing behind me. I looked back at the mirror. The woman was still there, standing just inches from me, staring at me with hollow eyes, her mouth moving slowly, forming words that I couldn't hear. The whispering was deafening now, pounding against my skull. Sarah, it repeated over and over, her lips moving in perfect sync with the voice in my head. I backed away slowly, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, my fingers brushing it, and before I could stop myself, I yanked it off its base, shattering the glass, and plunging the room into darkness. The whispering stopped. The silence was suffocating. And then just before I turned to leave, the voice came again, louder now, clearer. I know your name, Sarah. I turned away, my legs finally obeying, but the sound of her voice stayed with me, lingering in my mind. The mirror wasn't just a reflection. It wasn't just glass. It was watching me.
The morning light filtered through the kitchen window, casting long, crooked shadows across the counters. It had been a restless night, full of vague, unsettling dreams that I couldn't quite remember, but they left a lingering sense of dread in the pit of my stomach. I stumbled out of bed, bleary-eyed, needing coffee more than anything. I moved mechanically, the early morning silence pressing in around me like a thick, suffocating blanket. I was alone, as usual. My roommates had left for the weekend, away to visit family or friends. I couldn't be bothered to keep track anymore. It was quiet in the house, too quiet, but I had grown used to it. I liked the solitude, the peace still. That creeping sense of unease I couldn't shake had been building for days now, ever since the incident with the mirror. The whispers, the strange shadow, my mind kept circling back to them, even though I knew it made no sense. I wanted to shake it off, to tell myself I was just imagining things. But every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows felt like an echo of something sinister, something waiting for me in the dark. I grabbed a mug from the cabinet, the cool ceramic comforting against my palm as I filled it with coffee. The familiar warmth was enough to calm my nerves for a moment. The steam rising into the air like a small fleeting relief. But as I set the mug down on the counter and reached for the sugar, something caught my eye. A thick layer of dust had gathered on the kitchen counter overnight, as it often did in the older parts of the house. But there was something strange about it, something wrong. My gaze lingered on the counter, and the faint feeling of unease that had been gnawing at me turned into something sharper, more urgent. My name, it was written in the dust. I blinked, unsure if I was seeing things. But it was clear as day, Sarah, scrawled out in the grime on the counter, each letter jagged and uneven, as though it had been etched into the dust by a deliberate hand. The shape of the letters was unmistakable. It was my name, no doubt about it, but I hadn't written it. I hadn't touched the counter. I hadn't even been in the kitchen the night before. I hadn't left anything behind. I stared at it, frozen in place. My heart suddenly pounding in my chest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But there was no logical explanation. I wasn't the only one who lived here. My roommates, as sporadic as they were often in and out of the house. But this was my name, and it hadn't been written by me. I took a step forward, my feet dragging against the floor, as if I was moving through a dream. The name sat there, taunting me, daring me to understand it, to make sense of what felt like an impossible thing. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly as I moved close. The air around me felt colder now, the room suddenly too still. My fingers hovered just above the dust, the strange sensation of being watched prickling at the back of my neck. It was as though something, or someone had been waiting for me to notice. Slowly I lowered my hand, brushing my fingers against the dust. Nothing happened at first. It felt exactly like dust should dry, powdery, cold. My fingers left faint marks as I traced the edges of the letters, my skin brushing lightly against the countertop. But then when I tried to wipe it away, that's when it happened. I expected the dust to smudge, to fade under my touch, but it didn't. The more I scrubbed, the clearer it became. It wasn't coming off. In fact, the name seemed to grow clearer, sharper, like someone or something was still actively writing it, filling in the letters as I touched them. My breath caught in my throat as I wiped harder, but no matter how much I scrubbed, the name only became more defined. Sarah. It felt like the dust was clinging to my skin now, sticking in my fingertips like it was alive, like it was aware. I pulled my hand back, staring at the counter in disbelief. The name wasn't just etched into the dust anymore, it was almost alive, pulsing with a strange energy, as if it had come to life right in front of me. I stumbled back, my pulse racing as the hairs on my neck stood on end. I turned around, my eyes scanning the kitchen, the room suddenly feeling too small, too close. The walls seemed to press in on me, and for a moment, I felt dizzy, like the air itself was thick and suffocating. I looked around the corner, down the hallway, expecting to see someone standing there, someone who could explain what was happening. But there was no one, nothing. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, and I took a few shaky steps toward the phone. My fingers fumbled as I dialed the number of my roommate, Jenna, but the line rang and rang unanswered. Of course, she was probably still asleep. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't make sense of what was happening. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was changing, that something was wrong, that it was alive in a way I couldn't understand. The whispering had returned, faint at first, barely audible, but it was there. It always had, only now it wasn't coming from the corners of the room. It was coming from the very walls. It was as if the house itself was whispering my name. I grabbed the dish towel from the counter, pressing it against the dust, desperately trying to wipe away the name. But it wouldn't go, it wouldn't budge. I scrubbed harder, my hands growing raw, my breath shallow and panicked. The sound of my own heartbeat was deafening, thudding in my ears, as I tried to make sense of the impossible. And then it happened. The air around me shifted. It felt cold, my breath misted in front of me, as though the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. I froze, the towel still in my hand, my eyes locked on the name,
Still there, taunting me. I tried to move, to get away, but my feet felt glued to the floor. It was like I couldn't escape, like the house was holding me. My vision swam, the edges of my sight blurring as the whispering grew louder. It was more than just a voice now, it was a presence, creeping in on me, wrapping itself around me, pulling at my Sarah. It was a whisper, yes, but it was unmistakably close, like it was coming from inside my own head. My name was dripping from the walls, the ceiling, the very air around me. The house itself had become alive. A monstrous thing, wrapping itself around me, suffocating me. I staggered back, my chest tight with panic. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The room felt wrong, so wrong that it made my skin crawl, made my thoughts scatter in every direction. The name was still there, growing clearer and clearer, written in dust, as though it was calling to me. I ran out of the kitchen, into the hallway, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of the house. But when I looked back, the dust on the counter shimmered in the dim light, the letters perfectly formed, glowing faintly. My name, written in the dust. It followed me. It was everywhere, and it wasn't going to let me forget. That night, I had the most vivid dream. I had always been a heavy sleeper, rarely remembering anything I dreamt. But this one, it felt too real, too palpable. I was standing in my living room, staring at the mirror that had been hanging on the wall for days now. It wasn't the mirror itself that struck me as unusual. It was the way the room felt. The air was thick, heavy, pressing in from all sides, making it hard to breathe. The lights in the room were dim, casting long, ominous shadows that stretched across the floor and up the walls. I wasn't sure how I had gotten there, but I knew something was wrong. There was an oppressive sense of dread crawling under my skin, making my heartbeat thrum in my chest. I stood still, rooted to the spot, staring at the reflection in front of me. The room was the same as it always had been, familiar, comforting even, but the reflection, that wasn't right. I could see myself standing there, eyes wide with confusion. But there was something behind me, something I couldn't quite make out. At first it was just a dark shape, a shadow flickering in the periphery of the mirror. My breath quickened, and I found myself drawn to it, as though it was calling me, beckoning me to look closer. And then I saw, the figure behind me was pale, almost translucent, its form hazy and distorted, like it was a thing made of mist or smoke. The face was obscured, hidden in shadow, but even from a distance, I could feel its eyes on me, cold, empty eyes, staring straight at me, as if it was waiting for something, waiting for me. My body froze, and a shiver ran down my spine, the kind that comes from a deep, primal fear you can't name. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, to break the spell, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. It was like I was trapped in it. Like something invisible was holding me in place, forcing me to face what was behind me. Knowing that the moment I looked away, it would reach out, and then it spoke. Not aloud, not with a voice I could hear, but a whisper, soft and smooth, curling into my mind like a forbidden secret. It was my name. A single word, Sarah. The sound of it was enough to make my stomach twist in terror, as if the very air had become thick with the weight of that voice. I had heard it before. My name, but this time it was different. It was no longer familiar, no longer comforting. It was a command, a summons, a dark invitation. I had no choice but to heed. Without even thinking, my body moved of its own accord, spinning around toward the source of the voice, but there was nothing there. Nothing. The room behind me was empty, silent, and still. I blinked, my heart hammering in my chest, and turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, but now it was closer, much closer. Its form had become clearer, more solid, though its face remained hidden in shadow. The faintest glimmer of a smile tugged at the edges of its obscured mouth. I could feel it, a sense of dark satisfaction radiating from it, as if it had been waiting for me, watching me, for longer than I could possibly understand. The reflection of me, my real self, was still standing there, frozen in place. But the other version of me in the mirror, that person was moving. Slowly, it raised its hand,
as if reaching out toward me, and I could feel the chill in the air around me, the temperature dropping, the shadows creeping in deeper. It was like the room itself had become a part of the mirror, pulling everything into its depths. "Sarah," the whisper came again, more insistent this time, and though the voice was soft, it was like it had been etched into my soul. I couldn't stop myself from looking. The figure in the reflection leaned closer, its face inching toward mine, until it was only inches away from the glass. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I was trapped, caught in the reflection, unable to move, unable to escape. I wanted to scream, to break free, but my voice wouldn't come. Then the figure did something that sent a shock of terror through my veins. It smiled, not just a normal smile, no, this was something wrong, something twisted. Its mouth stretched too wide, the edges of its lips curling back in a grotesque grin. The teeth that were revealed weren't human. They were sharp, jagged, like the fangs of some animal or something else. And those eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, they were no longer just watching me. They were waiting for me to make the next move. The smile widened, as if it had won, as if it knew it had me. The whisper came again. "Sarah." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen, locked in place by something I couldn't understand. And then a part of me, the rational part, began to scream. "This is just a dream. It has to be a dream. It can't be real. I have to wake up. I have to get out of here." And then, I felt it. A cold breath on my neck, soft and chilling, like fingers brushing against my skin. The sensation of something standing just behind me, so close that I could feel its presence. But when I turned around, there was nothing. No one. Just the stillness of the room. But the air, it was wrong. It was thick with something unseen. Something far too close. "Sarah," the voice whispered again, this time right in my ear, and the chill that followed it nearly made me collapse. I woke up. I shot upright in bed, my heart hammering in my chest, my breathing shallow and rapid, as if I had just sprinted a marathon. My body was drenched in cold sweat, and the sheets were twisted around my legs. The room was dark, too dark, the silence too deep, but the air felt different. I blinked, trying to shake off the remnants of the dream, but the feeling lingered. The name, the figure, the whispering. My fingers trembled as I reached for the bedside lamp, flicking it on with a snap. The light flooded the room, illuminating every corner, every shadow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I rubbed my eyes, trying to steady my breath, my mind racing, trying to convince myself it was just a dream, a figment of my imagination brought on by stress, by the oppressive atmosphere of the house. But something about it felt too real. The air felt colder now, colder than it should have been in the middle of summer, and I could hear my own breath coming out in short, shaky bursts. The whispers still echoed in my mind, a low hum, like a buzzing in my ears impossible to ignore. I glanced toward the mirror. It was still there, just across from the bed, hanging silently on the wall. The reflection was calm, undisturbed, but something inside me, a primal instinct, urged me not to look too closely, not to approach. I sat still in bed, staring at the reflection of my room, my breath shallow, my mind replaying the dream in endless loops. And then, just as I thought I had regained some semblance of control, the whisper came again, soft, insistent. "Sarah." I froze. My blood ran cold as the sound of my name echoed in my mind, clearer than ever before. The whisper was no longer a dream. It was real. I didn't turn toward the mirror, but in the reflection, something else did, and I could feel it, right behind me. The evening had settled in, the kind of deep oppressive darkness that only comes when the house has been quiet for too long. I had just finished dinner, something quick and uneventful, and found myself wandering around the house, feeling that familiar gnawing unease creeping up my spine again. It was the kind of feeling that's hard to place, but easy to sense. The house was too still, the silence too thick, and every shadow seemed to stretch just a little longer than it should have. For days now, strange things had been happening. The whispers, the name written in the dust, the mirror that seemed to breathe when I wasn't looking. It was as if the house had become a living, breathing entity, watching me, waiting for me to do something, anything that would make it more alive. And yet, despite the growing dread, I couldn't bring myself to leave. There was something in me that needed to stay, something that made me think if I just endured it long enough, I'd understand what was happening. But tonight, the sound was different. I heard it clearly, dragging across the floor. It started off faint, just a soft scraping noise, like something heavy being pulled slowly, methodically, across the floorboards upstairs. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. It was coming from the room with the mirror. That room had always felt off to me, even before all the strange occurrences. I had tried to avoid it, but now the sound seemed to demand my attention, like the house itself was calling me. I froze for a moment, standing in the hallway, my pulse racing in my throat. I knew I should ignore it. I knew I should turn around, walk away, and pretend I hadn't heard a thing. But that thing, whatever it was, had been following me for days, whispering my name, waiting just out of reach, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The curiosity, the need to understand, overpowered my better judgment. I walked slowly up the stairs, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence. The house felt colder, the air heavier. As I neared the top of the staircase, the scraping noise was still there, faint, but persistent, pulling at my sanity, gnawing away at the edges of my composure. My hands trembled as I reached the top, the narrow hallway in front of me shrouded in shadows. The door to the guest room, where the mirror had been hanging, was closed, but I could feel it, something on the other side. I reached for the doorknob. It felt cold beneath my fingers, colder than it should have been. The door itself was sturdy, old wood that had long since settled into the framework of the house. But when I tried to turn the knob, it wouldn't budge. I pushed harder, pressing my shoulder against the door, but it was like something was holding it closed from the inside. My breath quickened, my heart hammering in my chest. As I pushed and pulled with all my strength, the door wouldn't open. The scraping sound from inside continued, like something or someone was moving in the room, dragging something heavy across the floor. I couldn't tell if it was real, or just the sound of my mind unraveling. I wanted to scream, to break the door down, but something kept me there, frozen in place, as if I was meant to hear this, as if this moment was inevitable. And then from behind the door came the whisper. It was soft at first, barely audible, like the wind moving through the cracks in the old house, but it grew louder, clearer, until it was unmistakable. Sarah. It was my name, no doubt about it, but it wasn't the whisper I had heard before. This time, it was different. It was distorted, like someone was trying to mock me, to twist it into something unrecognizable. The voice was wrong, too clear, too purposeful. It wasn't just a whisper now. It was a command. It was demanding that I listen, that I open the door. I stepped back from the door, my feet cold against the hardwood floor, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The whisper continued, rolling over me, crawling into my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts. It was my name, but it was wrong. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't just me anymore. It was something else, and it was mocking me. I reached for the door again, this time pulling harder, desperate to understand what was behind it. The handle groaned, but it didn't move. Something was holding it. My pulse pounded in my ears as I pressed my ear against the cold wood, trying to hear what was happening on the other side. But the whisper drowned everything else out. It was growing louder, faster, like it was getting closer, like something was moving behind the door, waiting for me to open it. The scraping stopped. Dead silence. My stomach twisted into knots. I stood there, pressing my ear against the door, waiting for something to happen. The absence of sound felt more suffocating than the noise. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it again. Sarah. The voice wasn't soft anymore. It was a growl, low and guttural, like something inside the room had been waiting to speak, to reach out, to tear through the door. I recoiled, my heart threatening to beat out of my chest. The air in the hallway had turned cold, almost painfully so, and the shadows seemed to stretch further than they should. The whisper was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't calling my name anymore. It was laughing. That's when I noticed it. The faintest crack of light under the door. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the way the hallway light spilled under the door. But when I looked closer, I saw it. Something was moving behind the crack. A shadow too large to be from a person, too solid to be a trick of the light. It was shifting, growing larger, as if whatever was on the other side was pressing itself against the door, trying to get out. I stepped back quickly, my mind racing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't something I could explain. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but I knew one thing for sure. It was in there. Whatever was making the noise, whatever was whispering my name, whatever had been lurking in the shadows of this house for so long, it was waiting for me to open that door. But I couldn't open it. Not yet. I couldn't face it. I couldn't let it out. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my body frozen in place, my heart pounding louder with every second. The sound of my name echoed in my mind, getting louder and louder, until it felt like it was coming from inside my head. The door rattled again, this time with a force that made the walls shake, the floor beneath me groaning in protest. "Sarah," the voice called again, only this time, it wasn't just in my head. It was all around me, like the house itself was speaking my name. I knew then, with a sickening certainty, that the thing on the other side of that door wasn't waiting for an invitation. It wasn't waiting for me to open it. It was waiting for me to make a choice, to step closer, to give in to the fear. The house had been watching me, but now the house wanted me to unlock the door, to let it in, to let whatever was inside become a part of me. I couldn't do it. I couldn't face what was behind that door, but I knew that the longer I stood there, the harder it would be to walk away. And that was the thing, wasn't it? The house was never going to let me go. I turned slowly, my legs trembling, my mind racing. My breath was shallow as I walked down the hallway, each step echoing in the empty space. But even as I turned away from the door, I knew it wouldn't be the last time I'd hear the whispering. And deep down, I knew that whatever was behind that door would follow me. It was only a matter of time before it found its way out.
I couldn't resist anymore. There, standing in the dim light of my room, the mirror across from my bed seemed to call to me. I had tried ignoring it for days, avoiding it with every step, pretending I didn't notice the way it gleamed in the corner of the room, its surface too polished for a house this old. But tonight, I couldn't look away any longer. The pull had become too strong. I had already felt the growing dread that came with knowing something was wrong with it, something I couldn't quite understand, but it was like my body was moving without my permission, like I was already halfway to the mirror before I even realized what I was doing. My reflection stared back at me, just as it always had. At first, it was perfectly normal. My eyes were wide, tired, as they always were late. My hair hung a little limp around my face, and I looked exhausted, a faint bruise under my right eye where I had bumped into the corner of the kitchen counter earlier that day. It was me. It was familiar. It was safe. But I knew something wasn't right. The air in the room felt colder, heavier. The faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs seemed miles away. There was nothing but the sound of my breathing and the soft, flickering light of the lamp beside the mirror. My heartbeat began to pick up as I stared into the glass, trying to steady my racing thoughts. And then it started. The first change was subtle, so subtle I almost thought I had imagined it. My reflection, just a second ago so ordinary, shifted, just slight. My face, which had been expressionless, now held the faintest hint of a smile. It was tiny at first, just the corners of my mouth pulling up a fraction, as though the reflection had been watching me all along, waiting for me to notice. But that wasn't me. I didn't smile. I didn't feel like smiling. I leaned in closer to the glass, narrowing my eyes, trying to figure out if it was a trick of the light, but the smile grew, almost imperceptibly, a little wider now, until the edges of my mouth stretched unnaturally thin, like something was trying to tear at the surface of the glass. The reflection didn't move with me anymore. It didn't mimic my movements. I raised my hand to touch the surface of the mirror, and the reflection followed, but it wasn't me doing it. The other figure in the glass was doing it on its own, slowly, deliberately, as if I were merely a passenger in my own body. And then it happened. The eyes. For a moment, everything in the room seemed to stop, like time had frozen. My heartbeat echoed in my ear. The eyes that stared back at me from the mirror, those weren't mine. They were too cold, too empty. My own reflection's gaze had shifted, growing darker. The whites of the eyes now a sickly shade of gray. The pupils dilating, narrowing with a hunger I didn't understand. I could feel it then, a crawling sensation across my skin, like something was watching me from inside the glass. Something more than just my reflection. The smile on the figure's face grew wider, twisting with an unnatural sharpness, as though its face was stretching unnaturally beyond what it should have been. Its mouth opened slightly, the lips parting just enough to reveal teeth that were too white, too sharp, like they had been filed to a point. It wasn't a grin anymore. It was a threat. The worst part was the eyes. The moment those cold, hollow eyes locked onto mine, I knew. It had been waiting for me. Sarah. The whisper came from the reflection's mouth, though it didn't move. The voice was mine, or at least it sounded like mine. But it was wrong. Too smooth. Too perfect. It crawled into my ears like an invasive thought, leaving no room for anything else. The sound of my name, spoken by that thing, sent a shudder down my spine, something so visceral, so deep. I couldn't breathe for a second. I didn't speak. I didn't move. But I couldn't look away. It was like the reflection was drawing me in, sucking me deeper into its world, deeper into that impossible, twisting smile, those eyes, that thing staring back at me with so much intent, so much knowing. It was watching me, but worse than that, it was waiting for me. I blinked, but the figure didn't blink back. Its eyes stayed locked on me, the pupils dark and unblinking. I took a hesitant step back from the mirror, but the figure's movement was faster, matching my retreat, the smile growing wider still. I swallowed, my throat dry, and tried to take another step back. But my legs felt heavy, like they were filled with lead. My reflection didn't just move anymore. It was alive in ways I couldn't explain. It tilted its head slightly, as though acknowledging me, a strange kind of curiosity in its movements. I was paralyzed. The room around me seemed to distort, the edges blurring as the figure's smile stretched even further. The eyes, it felt like they were inside my head now, crawling through my thoughts, burrowing into the deepest parts of my mind, pulling up memories I hadn't thought about in years. Old fears, old regrets. It knew everything. The whispering continued. Sarah! Sarah! The voice was so soft now, almost a purr, like it was speaking directly into my ear. But I hadn't moved. I hadn't turned. The thing in the mirror had moved closer, its reflection had at least. But I hadn't turned my back. I hadn't left the spot in front of the mirror. It wasn't me anymore. I could feel it. The thing that was mimicking me, staring at me from the glass. It was wearing my face, but it wasn't me. And I was trapped. Suddenly, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned my head quickly, trying to look away from the mirror, trying to escape the gaze of that thing. But as I did, I heard it. That sound, the one I had been dreading. The reflection's lips moved. Slowly, deliberately. It wasn't speaking now, it was whispering. I couldn't hear the words at first, but I could see them. The shape of its mouth forming my name again, slower now, almost like it was savoring the sound of it. My name, Sarah, carved into the air like a dark promise. And then I felt it. A hand. A cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat, but there was no one there. The room was empty. Silent. The air was thick, but there was nothing. Nothing but me. But the whispers didn't stop. They didn't fade. The reflection was still there, still smiling, still knowing. It was still watching. I turned back toward the mirror, my pulse pounding in my ears, and there it was again. The figure in the glass,
No longer just a reflection. No longer just an image. It stepped forward, the glass rippling around it as if the barrier between our worlds was beginning to fade. The smile was still there, the eyes still locked onto mine. It moved closer. The distorted reflection. That thing didn't just follow me anymore. It stared at me as though it were seeing something I didn't understand. Its mouth parted again, and this time I could hear the words more clearly, feel them inside my chest, vibrating in my bones. Sarah. And then, just before it reached the edge of the glass, before I could scream or move or do anything at all, it reached out toward me. The mirror cracked. I didn't even have time to react. The glass splintered into 1,000 shards, each piece reflecting the twisted image of that smiling thing. My face before it shattered completely, sending the fragments raining down on the floor. And in the silence that followed, I realized one thing. It wasn't over. It was only just beginning. It all ended that night, or so I thought. The house was quiet when I finally crawled into bed, my body exhausted, but my mind racing. My pulse still thudded in my ears, a constant reminder of everything that had happened in the last few days. The mirror, the whispers, the shadows, it felt like the house itself was alive, constantly watching, waiting for something. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, seemed like a message, an invitation to some unknown horror that I couldn't escape. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I convinced myself to sleep. I convinced myself that it was over. I had broken the mirror. The reflection, the twisted version of myself had disappeared. The house felt still, almost peaceful, and I let myself believe that whatever had been haunting me was gone. Gone with the shattered glass. Gone with the voices. I turned off the light, pulling the covers tightly around me. My eyes fluttered shut, the exhaustion finally overwhelming my thought. But even as sleep began to claim me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The room was too quiet now, too still. The darkness outside my window felt too thick, as though it were pressing in on me from all sides. I tossed and turned, trying to find a comfortable position, but the silence gnawed at me, wrapping itself around me like a cold blanket. I thought I could hear something faint in the distance, just the usual creaks of an old house. Nothing to worry about, but as the seconds stretched into minutes, the sound grew. A soft, barely perceptible whisper, like a breath on the edge of my hearing. It was coming from somewhere deep in the house, too far to pinpoint, but unmistakable. My breath hitched, my pulse quickening as I held perfectly still, straining to hear it. The whispering grew louder, closer, until it was no longer coming from the distance. It was inside my room. I could hear it beside me, soft and insistent, as though it was right next to me, just out of reach. Sarah. I bolted upright in bed, the sound of my name crashing into me like a physical blow. I could feel my heart slamming against my chest, each beat a violent reminder of how deeply the fear had embedded itself into my bones. The whisper was there again, but this time it was louder, more and it wasn't just in my ears, it was in my mind, crawling into my thoughts like something alive. Sarah. I could feel it now, like the words were sliding under my skin, too close to my thoughts, too close to my I squeezed my eyes shut, covering my ears with my hands, trying to block it out to make it stop. But nothing worked. The sound only grew more deafening, until it felt like my entire body was vibrating with the force of. I clutched the blankets tighter, my breathing ragged, panic rising in my chest. It's just a dream, I told myself. It has to be, just a dream, a trick of my mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was whatever had been following me, whatever had been in that mirror, was still here, still with me. And it was getting closer. The whispering changed then, softening just enough to make my skin crawl. It wasn't just a call anymore. It was a promise, a chilling, unmistakable promise that filled every corner of the room, every shadow, every breath of air. You'll never be alone again, Sarah. The voice was clear now, too clear. It wasn't a whisper anymore, not in the traditional. It was a voice, smooth and precise, as though it had been waiting to speak to me for a long time. A voice I didn't recognize, but one that was so familiar it felt as though it had always been there, echoing inside my mind. I opened my eyes, my body frozen in place, my heart nearly stopping in my chest. The room was darker than it had ever been.
the shadows thicker than I remembered. And for the first time, I realized that the air around me had changed. It was cold, it was freezing, and it didn't feel like the usual chill that settled in at night. No, this was different. This was unnatural. I wanted to scream. I wanted to jump up, run out of the room, escape, but I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed by the weight of the darkness that surrounded me. It was suffocating. And then I saw it. Standing at the foot of my bed, in the farthest corner of the room, was a figure indistinct at first, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized it wasn't just a shadow. It was a person, a shape, and not just any shape. It had my face. I froze, my blood running cold as my mind tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was taller than me, its outline darker than the shadows that filled the room. It stood completely still, watching me, waiting for me to acknowledge it, to see it. Its features were obscured by the darkness, but I could see the shape of its face, the way it mirrored mine, perfectly, right down to the slight curve of my lips. The same shape of my eyes, but something was wrong. The eyes were too wide, too empty. The longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't just my face. It was my reflection, the reflection that shouldn't have been there. The figure smiled, a wide, twisted grin that stretched too far, its lips parting to reveal teeth too sharp, too jagged. The smile wasn't friendly, it wasn't human, it was a mockery of a smile, something that belonged in a nightmare, not in my room. I couldn't look away, I couldn't even blink. It took a step closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it was savoring the fear it knew it was causing. The room grew colder with every inch it moved, the shadows thickening around it, consuming the space. I felt the temperature drop, felt my body shiver with the unnatural cold. I was trapped in the bed, unable to move, my mind screaming at me to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't obey. I couldn't breathe. The figure stopped right at the edge of my bed. It was so close now that I could almost feel the coldness emanating from it, like a deathly chill that seeped into my very bones. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, louder than ever, pounding so violently it felt like it might burst out of my chest. And then the figure spoke. It wasn't the whisper anymore. No, this was a voice. A clear, precise voice. Like a command. Like a proclamation. Sarah. My name was spoken with such cold certainty. Like it had always known me. Like it had always been waiting to say it, to claim me. The words crawled into my mind, sinking deeper and deeper, until I couldn't think of anything else. It knew me. It knew everything about me. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even think. The room had gone completely still, the only sound my erratic breathing, and the pounding of my heart. The figure tilted its head, its smile widening further, impossibly wide. It was me. It was me, but it wasn't me. I could see it now, the figure's face, so perfectly mimicking mine, but twisted. There was no warmth in it, no humanity. It was an empty, hollow version of myself, something that had come to take my place, to be. The figure leaned closer, its breath cold and unnatural, its eyes locked onto mine. It didn't need to speak anymore. It didn't need to say anything else. I knew what it wanted. I knew what it was waiting for. And then, as if it had been waiting for this moment, it reached. Slowly, deliberately, it extended its hand toward me. It was the same hand as mine, the same fingers, the same skin. But it was wrong. It was colder, paler, and as it reached for me, I could feel a pressure in the air, as if the very room was being sucked into the darkness surrounding it. I finally moved. I didn't think. I didn't scream. I just ran. I bolted upright, my legs finally responding to the terror that had been holding me captive. I stumbled out of bed, my heart in my throat, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was happening, but as I fled from the room, I heard it again, the whisper, soft and insistent, right behind me. Sarah.